probably Bogart's greatest performance, though it was the following year that he actually won an Academy Award for The African Queen. But why we picked this film was because we really think in many ways, it, again, not a classic film noir in a way, but certainly has many of the elements that we associate with film noir, and was very influential. And of course, the director, Nicholas Ray, was an extremely influential director who has left his mark on cinema forever. But of course, you really can't get past those classic lines. I was born when you kissed me. I died when you left me. I lived a few weeks while you loved me. I mean, if that doesn't sum up what a tragic love story and a dark one. And the interesting thing, of course, is Nicholas Ray actually wrote those lines, but he didn't know where to put them in the movie. This was based on a book, of course, and it took quite a while for them to figure out what scene to actually have those lines in. In fact, in the original script, they were the last image of the movie. You saw them on his typewriter, and that he had typed those lines as part of this screenplay he was writing. And of course, that they decided not to do that. And they worked it into one of the scenes that we'll be talking about later. But, again, when I think about this film, I mean, at essence, it's simply, this incredibly heartbreaking love story, and perhaps one of the most incredible ones ever committed to film, because it really is about love. I mean, it looks and feels and, has the trappings of film noir, and there's a murder, of course, but it's really about, the dark places in a man's soul, and then a woman who thinks that she can heal him. And, and of course, it does have the key element of film noir. It has a flawed hero. And then, of course, the distinctive, visual style and tone that defines the genre. And this hero is sympathetic and weak, as many of the film noirs, and haunted by mistakes or sort of a fatal flaw. It's almost Shakespearean in that way. And he discovers himself capable of evil, and is consumed by his guilt and fear, and Bogart, of course, embodies this flawlessly. He's a good man, but there's this sort of Jekyll and Hyde quality to Dixon. What a great name, by the way, Dixon Steele. That's a great film noir name, and that there is this sort of monster, inhabiting him, and there's a sort of a self-loathing which infects, all of his desires for success, his happiness. It's almost like there's fate hanging over him, and that's very traditional of the noir genre. And then, of course, there's this most unbelievable evocative space that the movie takes place in, which is this Hollywood, style, Spanish style courtyard with a fountain. When I lived in Los Angeles, I actually lived in one of these apartment complexes. And it's very, very strange because, of course, they're very small and each one is usually a single person. But of course, you look across your window, you can see, the neighbor and the neighbor's life. It's a whole world. And I think they did a tremendous job, putting this world together and creating a very interesting place for this movie to be set. And of course, it's also, a very mordant comment on, Hollywood and the mores and the pitfalls of celebrity. And we should note, of course, 1950, well, that was the same exact year that Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard came out, and also Joseph Mankiewicz's All About Eve, which are considered two of the most famous movies about Hollywood. Well, in the case of All About Eve, it's about Broadway, but, inside, American culture and American celebrity culture. Well, this is in that same, genre in a way, except of course, really showing us the dark side of it all. One of the interesting things I think about with Dixon Steele is, remember, this is 1950, and they do refer to the fact, of course, he, was in the war. We don't find out much about it, except that he appears to have been a good captain. You know, the cop who served with him speaks about him as a good captain. But, you know, the war, you know, was affected a lot of people, and really, you know, coming back from the war and integrating into society. And, you know, they didn't know what PTSD was in those days, I don't think. And I wonder a little bit about how perhaps what was not explored, and I don't know, maybe it's just looking at it from my perspective today, is what impact did the war have on this man? Because of course now he can't write, he can't do his job, fits of anger, he, you know, but it's just an interesting perspective to have, I think, today, that maybe there was some aspect of coming back from the war, and also for many of the viewers who had been in the war, that they kind of could relate to this behavior and this kind of Jekyll and Hyde quality, and sense of not being always in control of one's actions. You know, obviously it's set up so beautifully in that first scene at the bar, and we'll go into some of the more details later, but you know, this was, you know, Bogart's own hangout. There was a place called Romanov's that he used to go, and they had the pictures on the wall and everything else. And what I love about Bogart in this part is it really seems to be what he does better than anything else, which is this kind of, you know, when he does his straightforward macho parts, I mean, he's a good actor and everything else, but his best acting to me is always in these conflicted roles, you know. And if you think about Treasure of the Sierra Madre, for example, you know, that there's something about him. He's an idealist. He sympathizes with underdogs, yet, you know, he has this incredible violence sitting, you know, underneath, and comes out, you know, at moment's notice. You know, they're not really, you know, he's not really a victim, but, you know, at the same time, I find him this really fascinating. And of course, many comments, and we'll talk about this a little later, is that this really was the one role that was truest to Bogart himself as a human being. And one of the reasons he was attracted to it, and one of the reasons he decided to also produce the movie. And then, of course, Laurel Gray, you know, wonderfully played by Gloria Graham, is also, you know, kind of, I wouldn't call her a victim, because, you know, she's a pretty smart cookie. She's been around, and she knows what's going on, and she probably knows better, you know, than to, you know, invest herself in him, and that she's going to somehow change him, you know. But she just can't help herself, you know. She falls for him right from the very beginning, and then ultimately, you know, they both suffer, and as they find their love is unable to really continue. You know, it was based on a book. There was a famous novel by a woman, interestingly enough, Dorothy Hughes, in 1947. It was picked up and developed by Bogart and his partner, Robert Lord. What Bogart had done at this point, he had started his own production company in 1949 called Santana Productions. It was named after his yacht. And he was one of the very first actors to do this. Everybody else was under contract, and, you know, and they did what the studios told him. And Bogart, of course, was with Warner Brothers forever. And in fact, they were, you know, most of the studio executives were very unhappy about the fact that guys like Bogart were trying to make their own movies now. They would still be distributed by the studio. This was being distributed, of course, by Columbia Pictures, which was not one of the big, you know, the big studios at the time, but, you know, still a reasonably good studio. So they were very unhappy that guys like, you know, Bogart were doing this, and they didn't want to cooperate. And possibly that's one of the reasons it didn't get a lot of distribution and a lot of notice. But he chose this book. He recognized the power of what he wanted to do with it. They brought in the director, Nicholas Ray. Now, Nicholas Ray, we'll talk about, is an extraordinary guy, and he had not done a lot of films. He had only directed his first film a year or two before that, Thieves Like Us. But you know, he was clearly a great talent. And of course, the book that they based this on was a very dark, violent book. In fact, in the book, Dixon Steele is not just a murderer; he's a serial killer and a rapist, and you know, and a psychopath. And of course, you know, for the movie, Nicholas Ray, had to make changes, and Bogart was, trusting him because he thought he was much more interested in doing a film about the violence in all of us rather than just, a mass murder film or a film about a psychotic. So these changes were made throughout the film that I'll point to a few of them, but at the same time, you should recognize, as dark as this may seem, this was actually, the novel was much darker and much more violent than what we've seen. And in fact, in the original ending of the book, Dixon actually does strangle and kills Laurel Gray in that final argument. And just as they arrive to, Sergeant Nikolai arrives to tell him that he'd been cleared of Mildred's murder, it's, of course, he's arresting him for killing Gray. So that's a pretty dark ending for the book. And it certainly isn't a Hollywood ending, but they certainly left this in a way that I think was really had, more heart. And of course, there was an original ending that actually got changed. Andrew Salt was a brilliant, brilliant writer, a Hungarian emigre, like many were, brilliant career in Hungary. And he had written some wonderful films, Joan of Arc, the great Ingrid Bergman version. He wrote Little Women, which Katharine Hepburn had starred in. So he was certainly a top writer. But they continued to have trouble with the end. And in fact, the end that you see in this movie was not the end that was scripted at all. And this was very much sort of improvised, at the last moment after they had shot something else. And they just didn't want to, to wrap it up and make everything, in a tidy bow. They wanted to, let the audience kind of make up its mind as to what's going to happen to Bogey when, he leaves the apartment, and what's going to happen to Laurel. Again, the battles with Warner Brothers, with everybody, trying to set up their own companies. They were so upset, Warner Brothers, that the original casting for Laurel, of course, Bogart wanted Lauren Bacall, his wife, to star in the movie with him. And you can certainly see her in this part, and probably she would have done a fantastic job in it. She was a very good actress. But Jack Warner was so pissed that he was doing this, he wouldn't let her out of her contract to go and do the movie for her husband, which is kind of incredible, but that was the power the studios had at the time. And they were really, trying very hard to make sure that they kept that power. So, the other movies that, Santana didn't last a long time. This was probably the best film they ever did. They also did Beat the Devil, the wonderful John Huston film in 1953, a couple of other features, mostly starring Bogart, but one or two that Bogart did not star in. But again, it's an interesting period of time simply because, this was really the actors trying to break out of the Hollywood studio system, really have input into what roles they played, choose the kind of films that they wanted to be in, and choose the director, really have a lot of, and it's just fascinating, isn't it, that Bogart chose this part and this role, and that this is what he was so interested in. One of the critics, or actually Louise Brooke, wrote that this was the role that was closest to the real Bogart she knew, and that this was a role with a complexity, because the character's pride and his art, his selfishness, his drunkenness, his lack of energy, stabbed with lightning strokes of violence, these were really shared by the real Bogart. And there are stories about Bogart, breaking into inexplicable rage and scaring his wife. And, this was, he was a complex guy. I mean, as he was 44 when he met Lauren Bacall, who was 19 at the time when they married. And of course, in this movie, by the time he shot this, he was 50 years old, and Gloria Grahame is 28. And that's never really a big, plot point, but at the same time, and of course, Gloria Grahame's performance and her strength and her character is so wonderful. She's actually able to hold her own against Bogart in the film. It's kind of interesting to see what a huge difference there is in terms of their age and how that sort of worked. As I mentioned, Nicholas Ray's first movie, They Live by Night. If you haven't seen it, it's a fantastic movie with Farley Granger, and it really was one of the first kind of Lovers on the Run movie, which later on many people have done, like, Gun Crazy or Bonnie and Clyde or Terry Malick's Badlands. And Altman, of course, did an adaptation of They Live by Night, which was called Thieves Like Us with Shelley Duvall and Keith Carradine. But Nicholas Ray, of course, he came to directing late in his life, but he really was quite a genius and really turned Hollywood on its side. And perhaps best known for Johnny Guitar in 1954. And then, of course, Rebel Without a Cause, 1955, which is, the great movie with Natalie Wood and, of course, James Dean. And Ray was a beautiful, handsome man, very, seductive. In fact, the stories are that he seduced the teenage Natalie Wood and even possibly James Dean, and certainly encouraged Sal Mineo to explore perhaps his homosexual qualities in that film. So he really, and sleeping with Joan Crawford when he made Johnny Guitar. I mean, Hollywood, we think, these days, this was a whole nother world, in the 40s and 50s. And then, of course, perhaps the other film, that incredibly film, was called Bitter Victory, which you may or may not know. But, Ray and this film were discovered, of course, first by the French, the French critics, with Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. And in fact, Godard, after saying Bitter Victory, says, there was theater, with Griffith, there was poetry, Murnau, painting, Rossellini, all great directors, dance, Eisenstein, music, Renoir, and henceforth there is cinema, and the cinema is Nicholas Ray. So he became quite a big cult figure himself. And long before, again, later after the film had come out and had not been particularly well received. Gloria Grahame, wonderful actress. One of her first roles, of course, was It's a Wonderful Life. If you remember, she played Violet Bick, who was sort of the rival for Jimmy Stewart's affections. And of course, in the dark version of what life would be without him, she's a prostitute. She never really became a major motion picture star. Her contract was with RKO, which was not one of the big studios. She did get an Academy Award. She was nominated for Academy Award for Crossfire. She won an Academy Award for Best Actress, actually in 1952, for The Bad and the Beautiful, and continued to make a lot of film noirs, The Big Heat, and then of course she's also known for being in Oklahoma in 1955. But she was a really great actress, and unfortunately RKO just didn't get. She was supposed to be in Born Yesterday, the film that Judy Holliday played in, A Place in the Sun, with Elizabeth Taylor's role, and Howard Hughes, who owned RKO, simply wouldn't lend her out and forced her to do supporting roles and everything else. Now, also quite remarkably, she was married to Nicholas Ray. They had been married a year or two before, but the marriage was not going well. And Hollywood legend, of course, says that it ended during the making of the film, and part of it was because he found Gloria Grahame in bed with his 13-year-old son from a previous marriage. Now, this I'm not sure is true or not, but certainly things like this happened in Hollywood. And in fact, she and that 13-year-old boy named Tony actually got married in 1960, 10 years later. But so what happened, though, of course, was nobody on the set was allowed to know that they were in the midst of this breakup. And Nicholas Ray would actually sleep at the studio, in his office. And Gloria Grahame was forced to sign a contract because, they knew there were going to be these problems that, she acknowledged that, that she had to acknowledge that his judgment will be considered superior to mine. And I promise not to nag, a cajole, a tease, or in any other feminine fashion seek to distract or influence. Very bizarre behind the scenes stories. Often, as you know, those are more bizarre than anything else. Some of the other actors were also great side characters. Robert Warwick, who plays the thespian, Well, Robert Warwick indeed was Humphrey Bogart's good friend. They played together in 1922 in a stage play, and Bogart was just starting out, and Warwick was a very well-established actor. He was in, goes back to silent films and theater, and Warwick was very kind to him, and in fact, Bogart insisted that Andrew Salt write a role for Warwick to be in this film, because at that point Warwick was struggling. And I think his part and his relationship with Steele is very interesting, and certainly shows us a side of Steele that you wouldn't have seen in any other way. So so beyond just helping a friend, he was really doing something that I think gave a lot of more complexity to the character. And in fact, all the side characters, if you think about the agent, for example, whose the actor's name escapes me, wonderful performance, wonderful character, very interesting relationship, with Steele. Of course, as you know, there's that great scene where he actually, I think he hits him, I mean, and then has to apologize to him in the bathroom. I mean, incredible little character stuff throughout the film. The photography was extraordinary, in my opinion. Burnett Guffey was the cinematographer, not necessarily the best known cinematographer, but he won 2 Academy Awards. He won an Academy Award for From Here to Eternity in 1953. And he also won an Academy Award in 1967 because he was the cinematographer of Bonnie and Clyde. So I'd like to show you some slides from the film, and we can talk a little bit about some of the different moments. Jeffrey, can you put up slide number 1?
Are you able to see that, Fred?
I can see that. Can everyone see that? I hope. So here, of course, is the beginning of the film. This is the opening credit scenes. We see Dixon Steele driving down Santa Monica Boulevard. And immediately we're told, in a way, this is, a film noir. This is going to happen at night. It's happening in the dark with the lights. It's LA, but it's not, the LA of sunshine and happiness and romance. It's a different side of LA that audiences may or may not have seen before. I think it's a very evocative way to bring us into the film. And of course, I believe there's a story that the car that Bogart was driving was actually a car that he had owned once, or he knew that car and particularly chose it because it represented something meaningful to him. Slide 2. Yeah, so now we just see him in his character, and he's pulling along, some actress that he's seen, that was one of his movies and is talking to him, and his husband is. It's just a chance, of course, to immediately show us, and if you just look at his face too, that this kind of inner rage that's sitting, and quick-tempered the character is. And this is all getting established very quickly early on in the movie. Very, very smart way to do it. And then, of course, in slide 3, so now, of course, we see him at Romanoff's, or I guess they call it Paul's in the movie. And this is, it's noon, right? And people go and drink. That's what you did in Hollywood. And of course, there's Robert Warwick, his old friend who's trying to, cheer up and in many ways, support. So we also have a chance to see this kind side of Steele. And Junior, of course, is, classic Hollywood executive. Many son-in-laws and sons wound up with these jobs in Hollywood working for their fathers, and mostly were kind of buffoons and like this character is. And it certainly gave, a chance right away when Junior insults Charlie that for Dix to start another fight, and we very quickly can tell what a kind of character he is. And then slide 4. So yes, now remember, this is where he's gone home with the hat check girl, played by Martha Stewart, and Mildred Atkinson's the character, and he meets Laurel for the first time. And although, obviously they live across from her, she's, in the apartment, she's arrived recently, probably hasn't noticed her. And right away, there's chemistry. You can see just in her look as well. There's something about this man that attracts her. He's obviously much older than her, but there's a charisma and intensity and energy, and there's going to be a relationship, and it's done very subtly and very quickly, but it's done pretty well. And in fact, in slide 5, right now we can start to see how this this apartment complex works, where everyone has their balconies facing the courtyard, and you can look out, and and in fact, later on when they're talking, he says, Miss Gray, you're one up on me. You can see into my apartment, but I can't see into yours. And I promise I won't take advantage of it. And, Dixon, I would if it was the other way around. Again, very film noir, snappy dialogue, very quick-witted people, just saying smart things to each other, flirtatious. She's, obviously dressed beautifully, always lit beautifully. And it's not hard to understand why he's attracted to her. Slide 6. So here we are at the detective. So the detective, his old buddy, of course, has showed up. Detective Nikolai, great character actor named Frank Lovejoy, and he asks him to come to to the police station. But more importantly, we also find out the backstory. Where they were in the war together, and obviously Detective Nikolai has strong respect and feelings for him. Has to come and do his job. But because, of course, we find out that Mildred has been murdered, and there's every reason to suspect that, because he had brought her home with him, who knows what had happened when they got home together, that he would be a prime suspect. And in slide 7, and so, of course, they bring Laurel down to the police station because they want to question her. And of course, it isn't quite clear what she saw or she didn't see from an audience's perspective. She sees them together. She sees Mildred kind of, was there at the apartment. She very well could have seen her leaving, but maybe she didn't. But either way, she immediately professes that, that of course, she saw her leave. She's, defending, Dix in this scene. You can see how Bogart is so puzzled and kind of interested by this woman, and who is she and why is she saying these nice things, and then of course she's establishing Dix's alibi, and then her comment, of course, is, "I noticed him because he looked interesting. I like his face." Very straightforward woman, right? She's saying this to the cops. She's telling everybody right away what she thinks and why she thinks it, And then in scene 8, slide 8, so this is, their first sort of romantic moment. And of course, the line is, "You're out of your mind. How can anyone like a face like this? Look at it." I said I liked it. I didn't say I wanted to kiss it. And she brushes him off for the moment, but I think we all know where this is going. And then in scene 9, so this is kind of a crazy scene, right? Because this is him now. He's gone to visit, his friend, the sergeant, and his wife for dinner, and they start talking about how the Atkinson murder may have occurred, and you start to see this incredible. I mean, this is this handsome man suddenly looks a little nuts, right? And he talks about obsessions, and you get to a lonely place in the road and you begin to squeeze harder. And in slide 10, you could see, of course, the sergeant's so into this story. It's his arm around his wife, and he started to strangle her. But again, this is a fantastic scene, and very much speaks to supposedly Dix being a screenwriter, having written about a lot of murders, but you start to really question what's going on with this guy, and maybe he really could have been the murderer here, and so there's this wonderful tension, building as to, is this guy really a good guy or not, and then in slide 11, he does come back from that apartment scene, and this is the first time he kisses her, and of course, their love affair, there's no reality to this, that suddenly he's sobered up and he's typing and writing the screenplay and she's the typist, and of course they still live apart in different apartments, but clearly they're having sex and everything's romantic, and so there's this sort of brief interlude of how wonderful things might be. And it all happens very rapidly, which is fine. It's a movie, but you also, of course, constantly recognize that this isn't going to last. That there's something pretty dangerous about this guy, and nothing ultimately that good is going to really come from it all. And then in scene 12. Yeah, this is the scene at the beach, of course, and which it could have played out in a nice romantic way, but of course Dix finds out that Sylvia, well, actually Sylvia lets it slip out that Laurel had been to see the captain, again, and brought him for more questioning, and had never told Dix, and you watch him just sort of blow up, and without any kind of real understanding of the circumstances or what might have happened or why it happened, but he just, tears out to the car, and she runs after him and tries to jump in the car with him, and he drives off in a great rage. And then, of course, in slide 13, we see him perhaps at his, most violent. Well, this is right before, and just the tension in both of their faces is just extraordinary. There's a process shot, of course, but I find this a really dark, interesting, complex character. We don't really know where this is going at this point exactly. Maybe they can find true love. Maybe he can reform her. Maybe he's going to kill her. It's a wonderful. There's wonderful tension like that, at least to me, throughout the film. And then when he gets cut off by this young student, slide 14, we see him kind of go a little nuts, and besides just beating the guy up, he's got a rock, and he's gonna, it looks like he's gonna be, he's violently assaulting this guy, and he may just kill him, and Laurel is seen a side of this man that she just had never seen before. She had been told he had been violent, but she never seen anything like this before. And of course, this is foreshadowing, a lot of the more violent things that's going to happen as the relationship continues on. And then in slide 15, yeah, this is a great shot. I mean, look at that face, and of course with her masseuse. From Martha, who's telling her, this is a horrible guy and you got to get out of here, and, warning her, that obviously, Laurel's had her men in her life before. Of course, there's the real estate guy. She's kind of hiding out from him as far as we can tell. So we don't really learn a whole lot about her backstory, and she wants to be an actress, but clearly she's been involved with difficult and troubled men before, and of course maybe part of this attraction is she thinks that there's something she can do to help this man, and that she can change him, and for a while there it appears that she is doing it and doing it successfully, but this is again just foreshadowing that this is unlikely to continue. And then in scene 16, what's supposed to be a wonderful, great moment to celebrate their engagement. Dix takes this phone call, that's intended for Laurel, but reveals that Laurel is not necessarily, happily engaged. And this is of course when, he does strike out and hits Mel, his agent, and once again, we just see that this anger is just there all the time, and he's he's pretty paranoid about this situation and this relationship. Scene 17, we see again, wonderful film noir image of Bogart. This is sort of him at his most paranoid state. He's getting to go and confront Laurel and, really have it out with her. And as I said in the book, she actually kills him, And of course, the great, dramatic tension is we now know that, of course, that Dix has been cleared from the murder of Mildred, and Nikolai's trying to deliver the news, and slide 18. But of course, this never really gets to him. I believe, am I right, Jeff? This is him getting a phone call from the travel agent about the booking of the plane flight, or?
Yeah, the stage that's occurred in the bedroom, but he's getting the call from Nikolai at this point, and he'll hand off the phone in just a moment to her because everything's kind of.
Okay, but this is too late. That's the point. This is after the moment. Excuse me. So this is after the moment where he actually does attack her, where he, of course, doesn't kill her as he does in the book, but and he just and you just feel the tragedy of these two people who could have loved each other, could have cared about each other, and could have helped each other. But star-crossed lovers is probably the wrong expression, but it just couldn't. It wasn't possible. It was an impossible love. It was never going to happen. The following shot, of course, is Laurel in tears, and I lived a few weeks while you loved me, and goodbye, Dix. And then, of course, in the final shot, we do see him, going off and leaving this apartment complex to go where? We don't know, and do what? We don't know. And remember, Hollywood full of happy endings, and not this time. And again, this is a tragic love story on a very kind of epic scale, and very, I was really moved by it. I thought it was very intense, and so as I was saying with the ending you saw was actually not in the script. So Nicholas Ray had shot an ending. He wasn't pleased with it. He cleared the set, and Lauren Bacall was there at the time visiting her husband. She had to leave, and the only people were left for this final scene were Bogart and Gloria Graham, and they basically kind of improvised this final near death, near killing scene. But that improvised scene was really, I think, incredibly, dramatic, and again, I like the unresolvedness of the scene, and I think it worked very effectively. As I mentioned, when the movie came out, it was not well received. It was marketed as a thriller. It wasn't a thriller. It took years for it to kind of really take on the power. Again, people talk about the echoes of Shakespeare, the heart-stopping performances. For Ray, it was kind of a very personal film. These characters who kind of just lash out in this pointless fury, which we don't even really understand where it's coming from. And again, these obsessive love stories, are not unique. It's not unique. If you think of Hitchcock's Vertigo, for example, that sort of reminds me a little bit of this film in a way, this sort of possessiveness and the willful blindness, and what the derangement of romantic obsession, and this, it's sort of contradictory at times, but I think that's part of the fascination, is that somehow works, even though all these different parts of the movie don't necessarily line up perfectly. And so there's sort of this dark lyricism to it, and full of violence and cynicism and suspicion, and in fact, who was it? I think Curtis Hanson, who was a great director. In fact, he did the movie L.A. Confidential, if you remember that film with Russell Crowe, which is a modern day film noir. And he talked about the hypnotic power of this movie, and how, at least for him, it was so heartfelt and so emotional and so revealing. It seems as both the actor and the director are standing naked before the audience. And when that kind of marriage happens between an actor and director, how breathtaking that can be. So very different movie than Laura, last week's. Both fit very much in this genre of film noir. And I thought it'd be interesting to see them back to back in comparison. And I know many of you did enjoy Laura, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about this film and what you did enjoy or found not very tasteful in this film, and also of course any questions you might have about the film. So please, anything you'd like to talk about I'd love to hear from you.
Cool. Great talk, Fred. Ken Turner asks, today people get quite upset when a film deviates from the book. Was this the case in this or other films of that era, like Postman, Double Indemnity?
No. In fact, the author really thought this was great. They really accepted the changes that were made. Now, I can't say that's always true. Often, the authors would say things and not particularly like the adaptations, but it certainly wasn't like it is today. Where there's this kind of intense examination about the changes. And again, these film noir in particular, the books that these film noirs were based on were not great literature. They weren't considered some classic piece of literature, and how dare you tinker with them. These were often appeared in magazines, or were sort of pulp novels, as they called them at the time. And so the ability to go and make changes, and even James Cain, and Raymond Chandler, of course, and so many of his films, I can't recall there ever being a lot of bad publicity about that. But then again, remember, the Hollywood studio system was so powerful that even if there was bad publicity, or even if where could there was no, Facebook or Instagram, there was no place for this kind of negative publicity to ever come out. It was tightly controlled by the studios. They controlled, the writers and the magazines. Of course, there were tons of movie magazines, but none of these stories came out. None of the illicit love affairs, none of the heterosexuality, none of this would ever come out to the public. So the public really didn't know. And in this case, I'm not sure how many even necessarily knew or related. Remember, it also had a different name. The original name of the novel was Behind the Mask. Sort of interesting, but not In a Lonely Place. So it wasn't emphasized. Now, obviously, Gone with the Wind, and Margaret Mitchell, that was a different story. But but many of these, but no, not a huge issue as it is today.
Thanks, Fred. On the same vein about the novel, Alva Rogers was curious as to why you were surprised that the novel was written by a woman.
Well, because it's basically, Dixon Steele's story. It's a dark story about obsessive love from this complex, angry man's perspective. But many of these film noirs were written by women. Laura, of course, the novel was also written by a woman. And I think, she obviously was writing something that was very titillating. Remember, in the book, it's quite different. He's a psychopath. He's raping and murdering, and he kills the heroine at the end. And so her, I think she was writing something that was probably a commercial book concept, for the time. But I think, again, the sensitivity for the character perhaps really evolved more from the screenwriter and from Nicholas Ray. But I did think it was just interesting that that there were women writers who were taking on this genre. We hear a lot about the male writers, the Dashiell Hammetts and Chandlers and James Cain, but there were women writers working in this genre, and she was quite successful, actually.
Thanks, Fred. Tim McClement asks, how was it received critically and box office? Did it receive any Academy Award nominations?
No Academy Award nominations, not a success at the box office. Again, Columbia marketed it as a thriller. So if I went to the movie theater trying to, see a thriller or a whodunit, there's no thriller or whodunit element to this film. This is really dark love story, and it wasn't marketed that way. So it did not do well at the theater, and even though it did star Bogart, who was one of the big, attractions at the time. And again, it wasn't, in those days, it was the success of films was completely dependent on the studio's marketing, and not just marketing, but placing the movies in the movie theater. There really was no other way to see movies. So it came out and disappeared quickly, and critics didn't really know what to make of it. And so it really wasn't until, the late 50s that the film started to get attention, again, first from the French. And then later on, Andrew Sarris and a lot of the great reviewers in the early 60s. And Nicholas Ray, of course, again, became kind of a cult legendary character in Hollywood from his movies later on in the 50s. But, and now, there are many lists that put it right up there as the number 1, 2, 3 film noir of all time. But this really just completely just came and went at the time. And as I said, Bogart and the company didn't do terribly well. And the next film Bogart did was The African Queen, which was for Sam Spiegel and had nothing to do with his company, and completely different character. And but I think, for Bogart himself, and I think, as I said, many of his friends and admirers, they recognized that this was perhaps the most personal film that he ever did. And if you think about him again, in Maltese Falcon or even The Big Sleep, he's always wonderful as that kind of, tough guy character. But if you think of him as an actor, this was an opportunity for him to really dive into a part in a much more complex way than, playing, Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe, who, they're interesting, but a little bit one-note characters versus the complexity of this guy. But people didn't know about it at all.
And Fred, Roy Sorensen, he said that he was reminded of the rage of Robert Ryan as the police officer in the Nicholas Ray noir On Dangerous Ground, and his relationship with Ida Lupino.
Yeah.
Is there a comparison or contrast that you have any thoughts
No,
on?
all I can say is this is, very much, where Nicholas Ray came from himself. He was this absolutely incredible character and larger than life character, and his affairs and Marilyn Monroe and, endless, stories of him within Hollywood and men and women, and sort of this relentless desire to reveal the deeper, darker emotions of life. He was not afraid of them. He had them. He knew them himself from his own personal life, and obsessive love, and finding his 28-year-old wife in bed with his 14-year-old son, and I mean, crazy stuff, right? And so if you think of a lot of his movies, Rebel Without a Cause, or you think of The Lusty Men, which is a great Robert Mitchum movie he made later on, most of his characters are these very kind of complicated, men who have Ray, but, have good hearts. I mean, look, in this movie, Steele, sends the flowers to, the insulted, and then even the guy he beats up, he's trying to do something nice for him, and and then of course what he does with his actor friend, this isn't like an evil man. This is just a man who has real issues and challenges about this anger and rage. And we don't really know where it comes from. He was a successful screenwriter, is basically what we're told. And he went off to war, and he came back, and he's now this kind of, crazed. And again, I just think if someone was going to remake it today, they would be probably exploring a little bit about what happened to this guy during the war, and why did he come back this way and couldn't write anymore, and couldn't do his work, and how that frustration built in him. And not that he probably didn't have some anger problems, and was a drunk before as well, but it's all kind of built to this extreme level. And then of course what happens next with him is a really interesting question.
There's actually a really great conversation going on about the post-war
Yeah,
afflictions that these guys came
yeah.
back experiencing. I know David Striner had referred to it as a combat fatigue. That's how it was
Yeah,
referred
yeah,
to.
yeah. They had different expressions, but I don't think they really understood, the doctors and psychologists in the way we do today. And of course, there was the best years of our lives, and there were some films that actually did address, the challenges that these war heroes had, coming back to, civilization and going back to regular jobs. And so, it was a very, it was a tumultuous time in America. And I think that's one of the reasons that, this film noir genre kind of evolved, is that people were interested in and were feeling themselves, in this kind of, world. Where do I fit in? And, and what do I do with these dark feelings and this anger that I have now? And how do, what do I do? And so I think that, as a time and a place, this film coming out in 1950, although, as I said, not a lot of people saw it then, was actually speaking to something that was going on, and certainly something that Nicholas Ray, and I think, again, that's a great analogy, that film as well.
There's a point in the movie where when they switch to that masseuse scene, where it's a close-up
Mhm.
of Gloria
Mhm.
Graham, and it's like there's a shift in the point of view. It becomes more of Laurel's point of view, and leading up to this, it's been Dix's point of view very much. And I love what Alva has put in the chat window.
Yeah, yeah,
Women had to live with the men who returned from the war without the support from mental health providers, and you can see this increasing
yeah.
fear in Gloria post.
Yeah, yeah. So she's wrecking. You're right. I think that's a great point and a great question. And I think, again, that's why we showed that slide, because that's such a powerful moment in the movie. Because she's attracted to him. He's charismatic. He's funny. He's sexy. There's so many elements to him that she's. But now she's starting to come to face the reality that this isn't just a guy who gets upset once in a while. He's a dangerous man. And how do I feel about being with this man? And am I the person who can change him? Or maybe this is when she starts to recognize maybe she can't. And so this, and her performance and her shot, that shot is so interesting, because there's not a lot to say, and there's not a lot of action, but this is all, you really feel it going on in her head, and you see it through her eyes. And I do agree that, most of the film up until then, she was more of an enigma, and you don't really know who she is. And you don't know, maybe she's the one who killed Mildred, or, you don't know, maybe she's the crazy person in this movie. But at this point, you really start to feel for her, and you really begin to empathize with her. And you recognize, as she does, that, she still, wants to be engaged, and she thinks she's, because she is in love with him. But, I think this is, one of the great tragedies. Sometimes we fall in love with people who are not good for us and not right for us. And sometimes we even marry them, and we don't find out a few years later that aspects of who we are, because we're all such complex people, and we all have and it's hard to get to the truth sometimes and really see people. We're all great actors, right? And we know how to kind of cover up our faults and hide things, and we're not lying. We're just not presenting the truth of everything we are. But eventually things do come out, and again, to me, the ending was so beautifully done, because it's not trying to be critical. It's not saying, oh, you're a bad guy and you're the good person and you're the villain and I'm the hero. And it's much more complex than that. It's really just two human beings who fell in love and will just never be able to be together. Really
Much more relatable than had he murdered her, for sure. I mean, the audience is probably hearts are being torn out at the end.
Yeah,
More
oh
than
yeah, it would
had
have been
he.
easy for him. He just kills her and then goes to jail. This is way more interesting, right? Than that kind of an ending, and then it leaves you think, what's going to happen to her? What's going to happen to him? It's I love this, and you don't see endings like this very much in Hollywood. And I don't think you see many of them today either. That people like stories that kind of wrap up, and often are very frustrated if suddenly, oh, what do you mean it's over? I'm not going to find out what happened. I mean, I guess you did find out what happened. They're not going to be together, but.
Marissa Slavin has a question for you, Fred. There were things in those days related to sex that they wouldn't show. Were there things related to violence that just weren't shown on the screen then either, as well?
Well, yes, I think. Well, there are a couple of things they couldn't do because of the production. One was they not a lot of blood. We obviously didn't get the gory, bloody scenes. People would be shot, people would be killed, they would be, but you didn't have like the blood, pouring. First of all, black and white, but in color, either the color movies, you didn't get that kind of blood. And secondly, usually what would happen is that, there would be some, well, the smart directors. I mean, you think about Double Indemnity, for example. You never see the guy being murdered. It's all played in a close-up on Barbara Stanwyck's face. So much more interesting than actually showing the murder themselves. So that's not to say there weren't horror movies being made and there weren't action movies, but even if you think of the great World War II action films, we don't think of them as violent, and mostly because there was a production code and it was sort of falling apart about this time, but there was a tradition of trying to make the films accessible to people. They did care a lot about commercial success. They didn't want to turn off an audience by showing the violence on screen. So very often it would happen off screen or happen in such a way that didn't feel like it was gratuitous or they would linger on or emphasize the violence part of it.
I think Ray gives us enough here in a rather crafty kind of way, in the sense that you do see some of the crime scene photos. Yeah, and of course, with Dix explaining how he thinks the murder happened is enough to put us in the place of what really occurred that was so terrible.
Well, when you think about Laura, what could be more violent than this woman being shot by a shotgun blast in her face? That's about as violent as you can get, but you never see it on camera. And in fact, there were always issues even with knives. Like you could have a knife, but you couldn't have the glint on the knife. There were little subtle things that they always kind of wanted to make sure that none of this was feeling too provocative or too gratuitous, that served the story, and important story points, of course, but wasn't being done for some, titillation, purpose. And I think that, the directors, respected that. And
David Simpson was wondering if you know anything about the Nightclub Singer, and if you saw the scene correctly at the restaurant. Is it suggested that she and Dix dated, which seemed extraordinary?
Yeah, I actually don't, except that she was a real singer. I do know that much. And in fact, she, as I recall, was what they called, this was when I think this whole genre boogie woogie was starting. And she was a pianist and played. And she was actually, fairly well known, not, a big star or anything, but it would be very appropriate for that club. And, and of course, whether they probably did have a relationship. The impression I got was Dixon never married. He didn't have children. And, he obviously, was quite a successful screenwriter before the war. And, there's no reason not to believe that he, and as many of those Hollywood types, ran around it. And I don't think the racism existed, in terms of that kind of a relationship. I think it was pretty accepted. But I guarantee you Bogart probably knew this woman and cast her, because he did that a lot in this movie, right? He would bring friends and he controlled it all. It was his production company. He was the producer, so he could put people in. And I'm not sure, so I don't know the exact details, but I thought it was, it was a nice texture to the film and felt very realistic. And I think that's very accurate that you picked up on this kind of subtle tension that there was a relationship from them from the past. So I don't think
David, what I can tell you is her name was Hadda Brooks, and she was a nightclub singer. So chances are they probably encountered her, I expect, as you mentioned, Fred. Let's see, we've got a handful of other questions to get to. Let's see. Apologies. apologize. David Craig asks, how you think the film would have been different had it been made by one of the major studios rather than a small independent?
Well, that's a really good question. I would like to, my intuition is they would have really tried to find a way to have a happy ending. They would have really wanted to find a way that Laurel does change Dix, that they do find, at the 11th hour, they find out that he, is cleared for the murder, that although he has these violent temper and violent, qualities, that somehow, she's going to live with him and put up with it. And, happy endings were important to the studios in those days. And it probably would have been a bigger commercial success if they did. And it's not to say that every movie had a happy ending, but certainly most love stories did. And I think there would have been certainly some pressure to do that and to, find a way to not necessarily even soften Dix's character, but to give him more, of a redemption at the end. It's okay to be a horrible guy. It's okay to be nasty and violent and evil. But at the end, you have to, of course, learned your lesson and, and been forgiven and that kind of stuff. So I think we're very lucky this was not made by a studio and the creative control completely lay within, Santana Productions. And, there was obviously a distributor, and I can understand maybe why Columbia didn't want to, distribute this as a dark, obsessive love story. And they thought they could fool people and think they were going to go see a thriller, starring Humphrey Bogart. But, there's nothing worse, and I've had this experience myself, than promising, the audience one kind of movie and showing, and them seeing a different kind of movie, because maybe you got them in their door and you got their, $6 or whatever it was, but, word of mouth certainly gets out there. And but yeah, I think it would have been a very different movie if Warner Brothers had made it or someone like that, or else Dix would have been killed at the end, in White Heat, or, like the way the Jimmy Cagney or the Edward G. Robinson characters would have to die at the end for their sins, or for their evil. In this case, he doesn't have to die. He has to live with himself and the experiences and this passion and love for this woman that he destroyed, and I don't know, what does that mean,
Well, Fred, Doug Baker was also asking, did Nicholas Ray consider filming? I mean, he did film obviously different endings. Did the cast know how this was going to end? Did they just kind of
I don't know the answer completely to that question. I do know there was a final script that was not quite like this. I do also believe that Nicholas Ray was one of these great directors who believed that, and of course many modern directors today too, that you actually allow the film to evolve while you're shooting it, right? And when Humphrey Bogart got the script originally, he said, "This is perfect. Let's go shoot it. I'm happy with everything." And Nicholas Ray, while they were shooting, changed just about every scene. So he was really, like Francis Coppola or some of these modern, directors, not just fulfilling, some preconceived vision of what a movie should be. He was letting the performances, the situations, the experience of making the film itself, impact the story and impact the performances and what was working and what wasn't working. And I think, in that way, Ray was a very modern director and very unique in those days. And that's not certainly something that Alfred Hitchcock did, or people did improvs, like, improvisations, comedies, and, Howard Hawks with, Frank Capra, but you didn't see this kind of, and believe me, this wouldn't have happened, with, on a studio film. It happened because, Bogart was the boss and really believed in Nick Ray and said, let's do, what you really feel, and trusted him as an artist. And I think, that's what makes this film feel kind of different and unique and somewhat original, right?
Yeah, and I wonder, like, you were talking about Coppola a moment ago. I know that Nicholas Ray, probably predating your time at American Zoetrope, but he was around Coppola at that time.
Oh yeah, he had a lot of influence on a lot of these directors. Yeah.
But he got somewhat experimental in his later years.
He got very experimental. He worked with Dennis Hopper on that crazy movie, and and then of course he lost his eye. He walked around, he had a patch, and he was quite famous for the one eye, the patch, and this kind of strange romantic and experimental character in real life, not just in the movies he was making. So he was very much admired, even by the young filmmakers, even though again, if you look at his body of work, maybe it doesn't have the same level of quality of some of the who are considered the great directors of all time. But he was a spectacular director, made for this period, made for film noir. If you guys have not seen Rebel Without a Cause, that is an incredible movie. And James Dean, in my opinion, is finest performance, and Natalie Wood is amazing. So many, but it's not unsimilar to this film in that these are all flawed characters, and they get mixed up in this world that makes no sense, and there's chaos to it, and again, I think this really represented a lot of some of the mood that was happening in the 50s, in America, and they were starting, there was an ability to start to tell these stories, which didn't exist in the 30s and 40s, showing sort of the underbelly of America. And, while on one hand, everything was the Eisenhower years and fantastic and perfect and, in suburbia. But meanwhile, there was a lot of this, kind of angst and tension and drama seething underneath. And then, of course, it all started to explode in the 60s, right?
I think, there's this reference to the artifice. I think, like Simon Warswick, I apologize, Simon, if I didn't get your last name correct. He's mentioning that in the murder description scene that the lighting becomes shamelessly noir with that key light on the eyes. Was it a nod to the audience? Was it just a recognizable style at the time? But it does seem very almost artificially.
Yeah.
It appears artificially. And
no, it wasn't. There's not. You're absolutely. Film noir was not meant to be, realistic. These weren't,
it wasn't a thing yet either. It wasn't a recognizable thing yet.
Yeah, and you're right. There were, by this point in 1950, there had been a few made, and there were certainly, the Venetian blind lighting and the hot key lighting and all that, these tricks, and quite honestly, to me, it was perhaps a little overdone at that moment. I'm not sure it was necessary to kind of be that, that dramatic with the lighting. That's sometimes like you're not trusting the performer to do it himself. So you got to make sure the audience knows by doing this intense lighting, or extreme close-ups, or, directors sometimes get nervous, that it's not going to work. So they try little tricks to make sure the audience gets the message. But so I think it's a great question. And I kind of agree. I'm not sure it was necessarily the most effective, or necessary. I mean, it didn't hurt the scene, but it did feel a little more artificial. And that whole beach setting was weird. I don't know. I couldn't even. Is that a process shot? I don't think they were even at the beach. I couldn't tell what was going on in that scene and strange lighting. But so yeah, there were a few moments like that in the movie.
Mind you, if he hasn't seen Johnny Guitar yet, Simon.
Yeah, talk about reality.
Well, if you like a fight between Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge, you're in for a good night.
Yeah, it's a great Western, right?
It is. And one last from
Sure.
Barry Bender. No relation, I don't think, Barry. Did I hear the line "Best Days of Our Lives" in this movie? Was this an echo of the name of the award-winning film?
Maybe. I can't recall. Do you know, Jeff? Do you remember?
I'm not sure, but I think it's an interesting reference because there are a lot of self-referential elements in this movie. There's even that. I love that scene in the kitchen where Bogart is, Dix is talking about how if this were a film, if this were a screenplay, this is what our love story would be all about.
That's right. No, very much so. And, again, it was a movie about Hollywood and a Hollywood writer and a Hollywood world and commentary about that. And Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't remember that moment, but there were some, and of course, one of the reasons maybe this film was not so well received is, the people in Hollywood were a little nervous, especially the studio executives, of what was going on. You remember television was starting in 1951, 52, and that, God, there's a great speech from David Selznick from 1951. How this is the end of Hollywood. It's like what we read in the papers today. About how Hollywood's over and this is the end of Hollywood. And that's what they were saying in 1951. That it was all over. That the grand old Hollywood studio days were ended, and television's going to ruin everything. But somehow, Hollywood keeps going and the movies keep going. And again, this is a very modern movie, in terms of, in my opinion, in terms of the performances and the sensibility of what is being presented. So, again, thanks guys for joining us. I hope you found it interesting. And boy, if you probably haven't seen it, you're in for something special next week, because we're going to be watching Detour. And Detour, I did see when I was, quite young, and it never left me. There are some incredible moments, but this is very different because it was a Poverty Row studio movie. So what had happened at this time was that film noir had actually caught on as a genre. And there were movies being made like this one by Edgar Ulmer was the director, an absolutely brilliant, brilliant director. And there were other guys, Jacques Tournier and Richard Siodmark, working in this. And they were making movies in like 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, with no money and no sets. And they just, went out with a camera and a couple of actors, and they just shot, and scripts, sort of. But some of the moments that came out of these movies, and unfortunately, a lot of them are not available. So we had to find one that was, and this one fortunately is. But again, very different perspective on film noir. But and if you haven't seen it, I promise you have not seen a movie like this before.
What I can say, without giving anything away, is that it was in public domain for a long time. And of course, Criterion recently worked on a restoration project, and now it's in pristine 4K, so it's out there. But that tells you that it's a much different movie than what we watched.
Yeah, people didn't even care enough to protect it.
Was that Fred? Sorry. I didn't hear you. Sorry.
That they didn't even bother to protect it. They thought they didn't think these things were worth very much, But they were being made for like $50,000 or $75,000 with no stars. Although Ann Savage is amazing in this movie, but so anyhow, I hope you can join us next week, next Monday, and then again, Jeffrey mentioned we'll be taking a week off after that because we'll be showing The Big Sleep on the Sunday night as the second anniversary of the Westdale's opening. And then we'll be ending the week after that, of course, with The Third Man, which again is one of the most exceptional movies of the time. So thanks again for joining us. And again, any support for the Westdale you can share would be great. And please go to the website. We also have archived lots of old film talks and other things. We also have some film clubs if you're interested, small groups of 10, 12 people who get together once a week and talk about films. So really glad you could all join us. Thank you. And thank you, Jeff, again, for helping with all the images and questions and everything else.
A real pleasure. It's great to spend time with you people on a Monday night and talk about film noir. See you next Monday, everybody. Thanks, Fred, for a great talk.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.